resume the hearing of submissions on hearing stream 1 for the review of the Napier City Council's district plan, and today we're dealing with the issues of hazardous substances, public access activities on the surface of water. And we're going to commence this morning with being provided with some summary reports by our reporting officers. So over to you.
Kia ora koutou. I'll start with hazardous substances chapter. My name's Michelle Grigg, and I'm employed as a Senior Policy Analyst in Napier City Council's City Development Team. My qualifications include a Master of Social Science in Geography and Demography. I have 20 years' experience working as a policy analyst in both central and local government. I've been involved in Napier's proposed district plan since July 2024. Whilst I prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to hazardous substances, I was not involved in preparing the proposed plan provisions for this topic. I was made aware of a late further submission from Hawke's Bay Protein Limited after preparing my Section 42A report. I have prepared an addendum to my Section 42A report, which includes my recommendation 16 for the two late further submissions from the submitter, and this has been loaded onto the hearings portal and circulated to the panel previously. I've read all of the submitter evidence and statements in relation to the hazardous substances chapter, and am ready to respond to queries about these from the panel, which I'm happy to take at the end of my statement. The purpose of the hazardous substances chapter is to manage the effects of the use and storage of hazardous substances and of significant hazardous facilities, as defined in the proposed plan, that fall outside of the scope of the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act 1996, or HASNO. HASNO provides the general framework and is the primary mechanism for controlling and managing the use and storage of hazardous substances, but a number of matters fall within the scope of the Resource Management Act. These are, firstly, the effects on sensitive activities, such as the coastal and estuarine environment. Secondly, reverse sensitivity issues between existing lawfully established significant hazardous facilities and new or intensified sensitive activities. Thirdly, any residual risk to public safety, including risks to the public beyond the site boundary and from the storage of hazardous substances that could be affected during a natural hazard event. And fourthly, management of cumulative effects of multiple significant hazardous facilities near each other. The provisions in the proposed chapter address these matters as they relate to significant hazardous facilities and the storage, handling or use of hazardous substances in the natural open space zone. Napier City has unique features to manage in relation to hazardous substances, including the culturally and ecologically significant Ahuriri estuary, Te Whanga, the aquifer, and the location of the bulk fuel storage terminals adjacent to a residential area in Ahuriri. These considerations have informed, where relevant, my recommendations. So 11 submissions were received on this chapter, raising 58 submission points in relation to hazardous substances. This includes points made on relevant sections of the definitions chapter and also the planning maps. 4 further submissions with 6 further submission points were also received, plus the late further submission from Hawke's Bay Protein Limited, which I mentioned earlier. The issues raised in the submissions are presented in my Section 42A report under the following headings, which I'll cover now: definition matters, effects on sensitive and natural environments, cumulative effects, use and storage of hazardous substances, and reverse sensitivity and sensitive activities, including the proposed significant hazardous facilities risk management overlay. I will now summarise some of these matters. Firstly, definitions. In relation to definitions, I am recommending a number of amendments to the chapter to ensure consistency in terminology with the definitions chapter and the planning maps. The recommended amendments will also ensure the definition reflects current practice. The definition of significant hazardous facilities has a fundamental role within the rule framework and is required to give effect to the stated purpose of the chapter. Secondly, effects on sensitive natural environments. In relation to sensitive and natural environments, submissions requested a need to avoid duplication with HASNO and focus on the adverse effects of hazardous substances on sensitive natural environments. I'm therefore recommending amendments to the chapter in order to provide clarity on this issue. Thirdly, cumulative effects. In relation to this, some submissions were in opposition of provisions around cumulative effects, stating they are sufficiently covered in other topic areas of the proposed plan, such as natural hazards and industrial zones. Others requested amendments to retain these provisions, but to improve clarity in certain circumstances. In my recommendations, I am proposing an amendment to ensure an appropriate consenting pathway for additions or alterations to existing significant hazardous facilities within the significant hazardous facility risk management overlay, where the risk profile is not increased. Lastly, in relation to sensitivity effects and sensitive activities, some submissions requested avoidance of intensification of existing sensitive activities on existing sites within the risk management overlay to ensure that any reverse sensitivity effects and residual risks are controlled. One property owner submitted in opposition of the overlay. My Section 42A report notes that the introduction of the significant hazardous facility risk management overlay in the proposed plan is consistent with the National Planning Standards. The overlay is based on a quantitative risk assessment, a QRA, completed on behalf of the fuel companies by Sherpa Consulting Limited and peer-reviewed for Napier City Council. The QRA findings show that any change resulting in new sensitive activities would increase the level of risk to an unacceptable level. I'm therefore recommending amendments to provide clarity on the issue of intensification. In order to fully address the concern about intensification of sensitive activities, there is a need to introduce a policy framework to support new provisions for subdivision within the subdivision chapter to manage the creation of new lots within the overlay. This will be addressed within the subdivision Section 42A report. In terms of pre-hearing meetings, a discussion was held with Fire and Emergency New Zealand, submitter 288, to seek clarification on points requested in their submission. A pre-hearing meeting was held with Ms Gillespie and Mr McCormick, submitter 135, and the fuel companies, submitter 215, with follow-up emails seeking further information from the fuel companies in relation to the submitter's 2A Bull Street property being located within the proposed significant hazardous facilities risk management overlay. No other correspondence or pre-hearing meetings with submitters were held in relation to submissions on this chapter. Pre-circulated expert evidence was received relating to the hazardous substances chapter from 5 parties, 2 of which I will briefly cover now. The fuel companies, including Z Energy, as a separate submitter but included in the expert evidence, provided their evidence with an accompanying statement of evidence from Sherpa Consulting Limited. The fuel companies support the recommended changes in my Section 42 report and suggest additional wording for consideration for HAS R4 in order to address a submitter's concern regarding development at 2A Bull Street in Ahuriri, and to give effect to their resource consent to build a new residential development on the site before the consent lapses. Ravensdown Limited, submitter 246, who generally support the Section 42A report recommendations, seek an amendment to the rule framework through requesting a permitted activity rule for additions or alterations to existing significant hazardous facilities located within the general industrial zone. There were no matters raised by the panel in advance of the hearing. Based on the matters raised in submissions, the concerns raised by submitters Ms Gillespie and Mr McCormick about the extent of the overlay and potential impact on future property resale remains the main matter of contention. The fuel companies indicated at the time of preparing my Section 42A report that they would be in contact with the submitter to confirm the QRA findings remain as reported, as notified in the proposed district plan. I understand upon reading the fuel company's summary of evidence for this hearing that they are proposing an amendment to the rule framework, specifically HAS 4, in relation to this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's very helpful. I'll just see if we have any questions for you. Any questions? Just a couple of matters. The significant hazardous facility overlay currently applies to the large fuel storage tanks on Battery Road. Are there any other sites in Napier that, in your view, should also have an overlay?
There are other sites in Napier.
Within the jurisdiction of the district plan?
Yeah, currently sitting within the general industrial zone.
Yeah, I guess they would.
Yeah, not that I would think so, given the amount of the background evidence that's been provided about the risk contours associated with that particular facility.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the Napier context, it's a relatively unique site?
Correct, and especially the proximity to residential areas.
And just to clarify, so 2A Bull Street, they have obtained a resource consent to construct an additional residential dwelling on that subdivided lot, is that correct?
That's correct. That was obtained earlier this year.
Yeah. So that won't lapse for another 5 years?
That's correct. I think the fuel companies are wanting to propose an amendment to the rule in the event that it does lapse and they haven't had a chance to build on the property before that time.
And do you have a view on that?
We would support that suggestion.
All right, it's very helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
No, follow-up question, yep. Good.
Just with the QRA, I noted that there was 2 options available for where they set the boundaries, so 0.5 or 0.1 times 10 to the negative 6, in terms of the risk threshold. Are you, and I note that we've applied the more conservative of those 2, are you comfortable that there's a good rationale to justify that?
Through the chair, yes, the fuel companies have provided a lot of supporting information about the rationale, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to that later today.
Thanks.
All right, excellent, thank you. We could have the next summary report now.
Cool. So, Morena, my name is Brooke Hemmings. I am doing both public access and activities on the surface of water today.
Great.
I will start with public access. So I'm the graduate policy planner within Napier City Council's City Development team, and I've been involved in the proposed district plan since January 2024. Whilst I have prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to the public access chapter, I was not involved in drafting the PDP chapter or the Section 32 report. The content of the public access chapter is to provide for and enhance public access and connectivity throughout Napier through Esplanade Reserves, the coast, and within the mission precincts. In total, there were 3 submissions raising 9 submission points in relation to the public access chapter and 1 further submission point. Among the 9 submission points, there were 6 seeking amendments and 3 in support of the chapter, and the further submission opposed an amendment which was being sought. When collating the submissions on the public access chapter, 4 key themes were apparent, these being consideration of all public access ways, wording consistencies, biodiversity, and then general support. The key submitters within this chapter were Napier City Council Parks and Reserves team and Royal Forest and Bird New Zealand. In response to the submissions received, I have recommended a couple of minor amendments to the chapter. There has been some pre-circulated submitter evidence that were received from one submitter. I have read this evidence and am prepared to respond after hearing from the evidence providers. The panel also did raise a question in which I have responded to within my officer's summary, and I'm pretty sure they have read. And otherwise, there was no matters of contention within the public access chapter. Do questions for this one and then move on? Or?
We'll just see if we have questions on the public, is there more on that one? No, we'll just see if we have any questions on the public access issue. Any questions? No, no questions from me either. That's very clear, thank you.
Cool, thank you. Now for activities on the surface of water. Whilst I've prepared the Section 42A report for matters relating to activities on the surface of water, I was not involved in drafting the PDV chapter or the Section 32 report. The purpose and content of the activities on the surface of water chapter is to manage activities on the surface of fresh water. There is a close relationship with the provisions in managing the activities on the surface of water under the Hastings Plan and the Hawke's Bay Regional Coastal Environment Plan. In total, there were 24 submissions in relation to this chapter and 2 further submission points. Among the 24 submission points, there were 14 submissions in support of the chapter, although some of the submissions in support did seek amendments underneath their overarching support. And there were 4 submissions seeking amendments and 1 in opposition. When collating the submissions on the activities on the surface of water chapter, 3 key themes were apparent, these being a general approach, the use of craft on the surface, and environmental reasons to submit. The key submitters within this chapter were Napier City Council, Hawke's Bay Regional Council, Ravensdown, the Department of Conservation, and Forest and Bird New Zealand. In response to the submissions received, I did recommend a couple of minor amendments towards the chapter. There has been some pre-circulated evidence for this chapter, and I do believe that in some cases there is scope to change due to these. However, I would like to hear from submitters before any changes. There were no matters raised by the panel in advance of the hearing for this chapter, and based on the matters raised in submissions, there were no submissions that were largely contentious.
Thank you very much for that. Any questions? Just one question from me. Other districts in the country that I've done hearings for, some of them have bylaws controlling the activities on surface waters within their district. Does Napier City have bylaws on surface water activities?
No.
No, okay. All right, that was all, thanks. So now we're adjourned until we have a submitter.
Are they on?
and Mike McCormick, who we have on screen in front of us. Can you hear us? We cannot hear you. You might be muted.
Try that.
No, that's good. We can hear you loud and clear. So, good morning and welcome. Thanks for appearing this morning. We've read the submission that you've lodged, so you don't need to read that out to us, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight any key points that you wish to make, and then we'll see if we have questions for you. And so maybe you could introduce yourselves and then just proceed to tell us what you'd like to tell us. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kirsty Gillespie. I'm Michael's long-term pain in the backside partner.
And I'm Mike McCormack, and we own Bull Lane,
Bull Street.
or Bull Street, sorry. Bull Street, yeah. We've also got a property at Bull Lane, Christchurch, so it gets a bit confusing.
Yeah.
Which camera should we look at so we're looking at you?
That's fine. As you are
Okay.
now is fine.
Okay.
So what do you, you've read the submission that we've sent through. Basically, for us, it was more about the wording that's been used on the natural hazards thing saying, or not, on the hazards thing saying that it's a major risk.
Yeah, risk of fatality.
Yeah. So we were kind of after the wording to be slightly less emotional and evocative than that, because we feel that wording like that will put off possibly now that you've shifted the green line around that property. They may not wish to insure the property we build anymore because of the risk involved in it. And also just because at the moment they don't have an appetite to insure much at all, but also, just prospective buyers, if we were ever to sell the place, they're going to look at it, with the wording, there's a good chance if they buy it, they might get wiped off the face of Ahuriri. So we kind of wanted that done, or would like that dumbed down, just so it's not dumbed down, just less evocative wording that goes out to websites and other bits and pieces for public view sort of thing.
Yep.
I mean, the council granted us consent to build or do what we did to the property. So we feel that there's, it was also signed off by the fuel companies at the time, and it's just kind of like they've shifted the lines on a piece of paper to, I don't know, do whatever they did. I mean, the thing's been there forever and nothing's happened, so I get that something could happen, but, it's kind of like, well, really? And also, where they're storing fuel on us, next door to our property, it's like diesel, and it's probably the lowest risk of something going wrong with that compared to over the other side, way over the other side where the industrial area is. They're storing fuel. So again, the hazard's slightly been mitigated by the fuel companies.
We have no qualms with the way that the fuel company have operated thus far.
Yeah, they've been great.
It's obvious to anybody who drives around that they can see that there are tanks there. Yet it feels that all of a sudden this risk matrix has been applied. I'm not quite sure why, possibly to mitigate future liability should there, in the remote instance of there being an issue, that therefore you can go, well, you read about that on your limb or you knew about that. But in fact, it's just fear-mongering, and we have an anxious society, and I think there's a moral obligation to keep things in perspective rather than to just, cover your ass by making reference to the minute possibility of things that could go wrong in the future. That's what concerns us. We love Ahuriri. It's one of the best suburbs in Napier. We're really looking forward to coming back and building our retirement home there. But at the moment, we've spent a lot of money already, and if we potentially build a home, we may not be able to get insurance for it, or the rates of the insurance will be unbelievably high, and not because the risk has actually increased, we think probably over the last 10, 20 years, the risk that, the efforts that the fuel company have gone to has actually reduced that. But on paper, it appears so. And that's really concerning to us. We feel that this lovely section has almost got no value now.
Okay, anything else you'd like to add before we see if we have some questions for you?
No.
I think the only thing I would say is it feels that this arbitrary green line where it captures our property in a sensitive area, which is usually only applied to rest homes and hospitals and daycare centres, is only really a problem to us. And it's that the position of our site, as Michael said, is the furthest one away from any flammable fuel. And so it's like, why did they put it across our property? We had a garage and a sleep out there prior to demolishing it and developing the section, even closer to what we're proposing the house would be built. And yet, that was okay. Now we've got this sensitive category rather than just residential. I think it should just be residential.
Okay. Shall we see if we have questions for you now?
Sure.
Commissioner Brown, any questions?
Yes. Kia ora, and thank you for your submission. We have a qualitative report that specifies a very technical level of risk, which is where the boundaries have come from. And I hear your concern is around sort of the emotional language of the way it's being described. Just wondering if we get confirmation that the wording is standard or common technical language to describe that very technically assessed level of risk, would that satisfy what you're looking for?
I can see the changes that Georgina has suggested, and I think that is partway there. But what will the council put on the LIM? What language will they be using?
Okay.
We had a meeting a couple of months back, and we have, as far as I'm aware, haven't seen an update of what the proposed wording might be in that regard. So that is partway there, yes, because then it won't. People can obviously see there are fuel tanks, but what is going to be on that? Because that may well have a bearing on insurers and us should we ever sell in the future or when we sell in the future.
Okay, thank you. And just if the staff could address that in their follow-up report, please.
And look, I don't have any questions of clarification for you. I think the issues you've outlined to us have been very clearly stated in your written submission, and you've expanded on those this morning. So I certainly understand your concerns, and we'll be giving that some consideration when we deliberate on all of the submissions. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I know that we're like one tiny little residential couple that, might sound like, it's all about us, and we have no power financially to fight the big people, but it just, why now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Let's keep this within the realms of possibility or probability rather than talk about the absolute worst case scenario.
Yeah. Look, there's no need to apologise. I certainly appreciate that from your perspective. It is all about you, so that's fine. We understand where you're coming from.
Well, we really want to be able to come back to Napier and live there.
Yep.
But at the moment, we're basically like, oh, look, we wish we'd just never subdivided the section, never spent that money, never got a surveyor, never did the geo, never paid the money to the council to get all this approval. And because potentially we won't be able to get a loan to do the building, or we won't be able to get insurance or be able to pay for insurance once it's done, or to sell it beyond that.
All right. Very clearly stated. Thanks very much for coming in and speaking to us this morning.
Thank you. I hope your day continues to be running early.
Yeah, so do we.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
So now we'll just adjourn again until we have another submitter. Thanks. Okay. So, we live again? Yep, so good morning. We'll reconvene the hearing of submissions on the proposed Napier City District Plan. And at this stage, we're hearing from Amelia Longley. So, just for my information, are you submitting in your capacity as a Napier City Council staff member,
Yes.
not as a private individual?
No. No, on behalf of the Open Spaces team.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just want to check, is that the reporting officer's understanding as well? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. We've read the submission that you lodged. You don't need to read that out to us, but you're very welcome to speak to that and highlight any key points that you wish to.
Cool.
And also, if you have any comments on the 42A officer's recommendations, we're happy to hear those as well. So, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Given that you've read the submission, I'm assuming that you've also seen the map that we submitted with our proposed indicative public access routes. There was a link included in our submission to a GIS map.
Can you recall a map? No, I can't recall a map. Do you have a copy with you, or can you?
I don't know, but I could send through a URL if that's helpful.
Yep, that would be good.
Okay, who should I send that to? Sorry, bear with. Yeah, is that okay? I'll just bring it up on the screen and then I'll send the link through after we've talked about it, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Fantastic. So the sort of primary purpose of our submission is to include additional public access routes in the indicative public access route layer in the proposed district plan. What's included currently is just access routes within the Mission Hills subdivision, which doesn't actually connect to the wider reserve network. So, the map is up there. So, also included in this map are green polygons which show you where our parks and reserves are located. So, our sort of primary focus is across the Taradale Hills, which aligns with the objectives of the plan. So we have a number of reserves across the hills, but they're not all connected. And so the purpose of including those additional public access routes is that if subdivision were to occur in those areas that are proposed to be zoned rural residential, then we could achieve some connectivity between those open spaces and create a pathway network across the Taradale Hills, which aligns with the objective 2 of the public access chapter. Sorry, I'm a little bit puffed from walking down. So for us, with the existing layer, which only includes the Mission Hills, it's hard for us to see how that objective is going to be able to be met. There are no mechanisms in the plan without those additional routes identified that actually provide us an opportunity to capture those routes through the subdivision process.
Yep.
We would be reliant on the goodwill of developers to work with us through the consent process to achieve that. We see the benefit of mapping those out now, that if someone's considering subdivision of their property, they can look at all the planning maps, consider the infrastructure that's required, look at the zoning, and also consider the public access routes as infrastructure that they need to put into their subdivision plans alongside Three Waters, roading, telecommunications networks and those sorts of things. I noted in the officer's report that there was a reference to the notice of requirements process and that we could use that instead. We sort of see that as a less collaborative process for achieving the outcomes of the plan, as opposed to giving people an indication ahead of time of what we would be seeking in terms of public access routes.
And for us, it could mean we're dealing with multiple property owners rather than one, being the developer. So obviously that comes with a lot more headaches, I suppose, further along the track for any future pathway network we want to create.
Yeah. I think that sort of covers it. We have indicated some other routes across the wider Napier area. as well. Those just provide, again, connections between the reserve network that we have and some more desirable routes, including one at Awatoto, where we have I'll zoom in a little bit. That's part of the cycleway network. So currently that cycleway network is right next to the state highway. So the line we've indicated would move it more towards the coast, which would be a more desirable sort of environment for cycling. But our priority through this submission are those connectivities through the Taradale Western Hills subdivision and able to fulfil that objective number 2 of the chapter.
Okay.
Cool.
Is there anything else you'd like to, did you want to speak to any of the provisions themselves, or is your focus mainly on the map?
It's mostly on the map, and I guess if we don't include any additional indicative public access routes, the provisions for public access routes they're not really going to achieve anything because there's no mechanism to enforce them.
Yeah.
Previous parks team leader worked through a subdivision in the Taradale Hills and tried to enable public access through that subdivision by working with the developer through the consent process, but was unable to get it across the line because there's no mechanism in the operative district plan to achieve that. So we see that if we aren't able to indicate where these public access routes are now through this district planning process, and subdivision occurs in those areas that are going from rural to rural residential, once the subdivision's complete, the opportunity is completely lost.
Yeah, no, understood. So shall we see if we have questions now, or is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
A question?
Kia ora, thank you for your proposal. I've got a question around the location of your routes. Is the intention to lock in exactly those routes?
The indicative only.
Yeah, indicative. So if we came to the subdivision stage, we would work with the property owner on, what is physically practical and what's going to work in with the subdivision itself.
Yeah, brilliant. I have a couple that are
Go ahead.
outside the scope of this bit.
Go ahead.
The other pathways that we already have, and I'm thinking like we've got lots of steps on the hill and other areas throughout Napier, are they proposed to be covered as well?
No, because they're already existing, we haven't included them in our submission. This is more looking at future subdivision and the opportunity for future public access ways.
Okay.
Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, it does. I'm just thinking through the implications of that. And then I also note in your submission, you commented on the fence provisions, and just wondering what your concern is around the fence provisions.
In the fencing chapter of the district plan?
Yeah, but you mentioned it in the open spaces bit.
And we mentioned it in the public access bit, did we? Sorry?
Or am I? No. I'll withdraw my
Okay,
question.
we can talk about that in March.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
So just forgive me for this question. Is the map like that currently included in the district plan?
So there is a layer for indicative public access routes in the proposed district plan, but it only includes the Mission Hills
Right.
area, and that subdivision's already underway, so we've essentially already locked those in.
Yeah. All right. And so all of the yellow and dashed lines on the map in front of us, they're all
So-
non-existing but
Yeah, so those
desired
are,
indicative future public
Yep.
access.
those are our proposed public access routes. Indicative, again, so
Yeah.
not set in stone on that exact line. Yeah.
And you're just seeking the opportunity for those to be considered and verified or otherwise through future subdivision process?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, no, that's understood. We had a submission yesterday from the Emerald Hills submitter. Cam Drury was working for them. Do you know Mr Drury? He works
Yes,
for
yep,
strategy
we're
planning.
familiar with Mr.
So
Drury.
we've asked him to do a little bit of homework just on some wordsmithing because he had some issues about this provision as well.
Okay.
So you may want to just contact him and see what his thinking is on that. But I put to him, would a provision be appropriate that these things would be confirmed upon subdivision? So to indicate where they were, but for them to be confirmed upon subdivision processes. So it might be helpful to touch base with him and just see if your thinking can be aligned. But,
Yeah,
otherwise-
that aligns with our thinking.
Yeah, and you may be able to agree on some wording that would be really helpful. And if that does happen, you could feed that back to our reporting officers and they can feed that back to us in their end of hearing reply report.
Sure.
And if peace breaks out, that would be great. Okay, so thank you very much. Certainly understand what you're asking for and no further questions from me.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Right,
I'll
thank you.
send the link to that map through to the email.
All right, so now we're going to adjourn for an early morning tea, and our next scheduled submitter is Ravensdown, who we're scheduled for 10 minutes to 11, and we may be able to get them in earlier, and if so, good, and if not, we'll see you later, closer to 10:50. Thank you, everyone. At this stage, we are hearing from Ravensdown. So good morning and welcome to the two of you. You've appeared before us before, so you know the drill. We've read the material you've circulated. Thank you very much. You're very welcome to speak to that, and then we'll see if we have any questions for you. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a very brief comment from me before I pass to Ms. Taylor, and it's simply to say that our interest in this particular matter relates to seeking to avoid potential duplication and regulatory control around the storage and use of hazardous substances, particularly where activities are appropriately located in the industrial zone. So, on that basis, I shall pass to Ms. Taylor to take you through the key points from her evidence.
Excellent, thank you.
So the discussion on the 2 points I cover in my evidence, which is hazardous substances, the provisions and the activities on surface water, are in sections 4 and 5 of my evidence. The summary is of the key points is in paragraph 5, E and F of the summary in relation to the hazardous substances provisions. I outline that I now support the retention of the proposed significant hazard facility definition, which includes the manufacture of fertiliser and thus applies to the Napier Works. Given the retention of this definition and related hazardous substance provisions and the proposed amended rule structure based on the Section 42A report recommendations, I consider that a permitted activity rule that provides for the addition or alteration of significant hazardous facilities located in the general industrial zone should be included in the PDP. I consider that it is not appropriate or necessary to apply an additional layer of regulation beyond the has-no provisions on existing and thus established significant hazardous facilities located in the general industrial zone. In relation to the activities on surface water, I have requested the inclusion of a new citywide permitted rule that provides for the use of crafts on surface water bodies where this use is associated with environmental monitoring and scientific research. The proposed rule permits all parties carrying out such activities, not just parties with statutory responsibilities, which is what the current rule provides for. And as a subsequent amendment, and recognising that the estuary is within the CMA, I also recommend the deletion of Rule R4. So that's an overview of what my evidence says.
All right, thank you. Are you happy if we proceed to questions?
Yes.
All right, Commissioner Brown, questions, if any.
Might still formulate if that's all right.
All right. So I just have a couple of questions. I'll just take you to paragraph 4.17, 4.17, which is your recommended permitted activity rule.
Yep.
And I guess what I'm looking for you to do is to try and persuade us why that would be appropriate. It would seem to me odd to have as a permitted activity the expansion, additions or alterations to what can be a potentially quite significant activity with a range of adverse effects, even though it's located in the general industrial zone. So do you have any, can you point us to any other district plans in the country that have taken this approach?
A number of, like Christchurch City have no use or storage of hazardous substances provisions, or very limited. I'd have to check. They just rely on has-no. It's the main one I'm aware of. Dunedin has retained some for industrial activities in industrial zones, but only where there is a hazard overlay.
Right.
Or proximity to residential zones. Yeah. So does that answer your question? I haven't done a systematic review. I do a lot of work for Fonterra as well, and the South Taranaki District Plan has no hazardous substance provisions that apply to their manufacturing sites in South Taranaki. and Fonterra have had a number of district plans where hazardous substance provisions do not apply to their sites.
All right, well, if you are aware of any rules that are of a similar nature to what you're proposing here, it'd be helpful for us to receive a copy of those rules from other district
Okay.
plans. And the second question is, it would seem odd to me to not have any conditions in a permitted activity rule, particularly one dealing with significant hazardous facilities. This just gives you carte blanche to do whatever you like, basically with no conditions applying to the activity, which to my mind seems very odd. I'm sure there must be conditions that should be applied to additions or alterations to these facilities.
I was looking at the the recommended rule framework that applies for the whole hazardous substances.
Mhm.
So except for significant hazardous facilities, under Rule 2, the storage, handling, and use of hazardous substances in all zones in the city are permitted, subject to no conditions. There is a permitted activity rule, a proposed new permitted activity rule for alterations and additions in the significant hazardous facility risk management overlay, with one condition about the risk assessment.
Mhm.
And those are the permitted activity rules.
Right. Well, I guess I'd invite you to turn your mind to some relevant conditions here. I mean, for instance, if it's Ravensdown, or if it's your proposition that the activities of these facilities are adequately controlled under the HASNO legislation, you know, there might be a condition that would say that I'm going to say the applicant, but for a permitted activity rule, it's not the applicant, but the party wishing to use the permitted activity must demonstrate to the council's satisfaction that they comply with all relevant aspects of HASNO legislation, for example. I mean, I'm just a bit wary of, we're not talking about just small storage facilities here of hazardous facilities like a little shed containing some hazardous substances. We're talking about major facilities. I'm just nervous about not having any conditions at all that might deal with the effects of the activity.
Noted. I'll just highlight that at the moment, with the recommended Section 42A report recommendations, there would actually be no consent trigger, because Rule 3 only applies to new significant hazardous facilities. So that's part of the reason I was trying to get a rule into this part of the plan to provide some clarity.
All right. Okay, so you're saying based on what's currently recommended by the officers, there'd be no restriction whatsoever on additions or expansions to these facilities?
As I read the rule framework, yes.
Yeah, well, that would seem even more extremely odd to me. So, yeah, welcome your further assistance in terms of this rule, in terms of the issues I've outlined, and certainly looking forward to the officers addressing this in their reply report.
Okay.
Yeah. So just on that, hazardous substances, Hayley, any other questions you'd like to ask about that? All right, so that's good. Let's turn now to the activities on surface water. I'll just see if we have any questions for you there. Any questions? And look, I have no questions in terms of that part of your evidence. It's relatively straightforward, certainly understand what you're seeking, so no questions for clarification on that.
Thank you.
Right.
In terms of the further information you requested, what's the sort of timing you're wanting? Or
Within the next 5 working days, if that's possible.
okay, we'll look at that while we write evidence for the next hearing.
Yeah, exactly right. All right, well, unless there's anything you want to add by way of concluding comments, we don't have any further questions. All right, well, thank you very much to both of you for coming in this morning.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
Bye.
Bye.
Now, Nicola, we're scheduled to have Hawke's Bay Protein next, is that right? soon. All right, so we may as well wait for that, because if we start early with the fuel companies, then... Yeah, we're still waiting on the second. All right, so we'll just sit quietly till we have Hawke's Bay Protein online. We're hearing from Hawke's Bay Protein. Good morning and welcome, Mr. Watts. We saw you earlier in the week, so you know the drill. We've read your legal submissions, so you don't need to read them out, but you're very welcome to speak to them, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. So you've read my legal submissions, and I appreciate that. So I won't read them out to you. The topic today that we're dealing with is the hazardous substances provisions of the plan. And I started out in my legal submissions by setting out the legal framework that applies to the formulation of plans. And in paragraph 10, I wanted to draw your attention to the Environment Court's decision in Royal Forest and Birds Protection Society of New Zealand and Whakatane District Council, where the court held that where the purpose of the Act and the objectives of the plan can be met by a less restrictive regime, then that regime should be adopted. And that's really the general theme of the submission that I'll be making to you today. So my legal submissions deal with the issue of hazardous substances starting at paragraph 22. And they note, as you'll no doubt be familiar, that in 2017, the functions of regional councils were amended by legislation to remove the responsibility of regional councils to control the adverse effects of storage, use, disposal, or transportation of hazardous substances. And at the same time that that amendment was made, regulations were introduced under both the HASNO Act and the Health and Safety in Work Act to regulate the storage, handling, transportation, etc. of hazardous substances. In paragraph 24, I've noted MFE's indication that the purpose of these changes was to ensure councils only place additional controls on hazardous substances if they are necessary to control effects that are not covered by the HASNO or Health and Safety at Work Acts. And in paragraph 25, I've noted the MFE's guidance where they stated that the expectation is that controls on hazardous substances in RMA plans will be the exception rather than the norm. So the section 32 report I've commented on in paragraph 27. It acknowledges that the HASNO Act has a place to a role in the regulation of hazardous substances, and says that the place of the district plan is to manage residual risks, including cumulative and reverse sensitivity effects. The starting point of my submission to you today is that there needs to be a real and genuine need for the district plan to intervene in this hazardous substance regulation sphere before the district plan introduces rules to deal with it, because otherwise we're going to end up double regulating, triple regulating these activities that are already well controlled. In paragraph 30 of my submissions, I've noted that all of the other regulatory tools that are out there regulating these hazardous substances need to be taken into account when considering the role of the proposed plan. And the first point that I've noted there is that it's the regional plan's job to regulate the discharge of contaminants, including stormwater discharges. And I just highlight that because some of the commentary in the Section 42A officer's report is to the effect that the control of significant hazardous facilities by the district plan is justified because a lot of the stormwater in the district flows out to water bodies, and that's, in my submission, not unusual. In most locations around the country, stormwater is likely to end up in a water body of one kind or another. But it's the regional plan's job to regulate those stormwater discharges. So the regional plan, section 6.6.6, stormwater discharges and diversions, Rules 42 and 43. Those rules ensure that any diversion or discharge of stormwater from industrial or trade premises will always require a resource consent. And my submission is that that really covers off the regulation of concerns about the escape of hazardous substances from industrial activities. We also have the trade wastes bylaw being which regulates the discharge of substances from these sites to trade waste. We have the NES for contaminated soils, regulating the disturbance of or any changes to the use of contaminated land. We have Building Act regulations. We have a whole raft of regulation in addition to HASNO and WorkSafe regulations, which are detailed and pretty comprehensive. Therefore, my submission that in this post-2017 environment, the proposed plan can and should play a very limited role in relation to hazardous substances. And in my paragraph 31, I've suggested that the focus should be limited to what are real land use planning concerns, such as directing activities that handle large quantities of or particularly hazardous substances to the appropriate zone, or preventing the co-location of activities with particularly sensitive, of such activities with particularly sensitive activities or environments. And that leads to the conclusion that planning controls in a district plan, in my submission, should be location dependent rather than activity dependent, given that the particular activities, the storage of this chemical or that chemical, etc., are already thoroughly regulated. So that is the sort of starting point for protein submission, and that leads on to the further submission that Hawke's Bay Protein has made in support of Ravensdown's submission seeking the deletion of the significant hazardous facilities definition. I've commented that in paragraph 35 that Hawke's Bay Protein is not opposed to the definition per se, but is opposed to its proposed use in the Hazardous Substances Rule 3. I probably would put an asterisk by that comment, because looking at the definition of significant hazardous facilities, it does include a lot of activities that you would expect to handle reasonable quantities of hazardous facilities, but by no means does it include all of them. And just by way of example, one of the hazardous substances that Hawke's Bay Proteins handles on its site and stores is sulfuric acid. That it receives regular deliveries of sulfuric acid from a company that stores and distributes chemicals. Now, that company that stores and distributes very large quantities of these substances would not even come under the list of significant hazardous facilities. It's just as a sort of distributive activity, but probably has a much higher risk profile than the rendering plant does. So I just point that out to highlight that there are some inconsistencies in the way that this rule might apply, such that you might question whether it's really worthwhile. In paragraphs 36 and 37, I've just noted that in the proposed plan, as it was notified there was a distinction between major hazard facilities and significant hazard facilities. And there is a major hazard facility overlay that applies to the fuel storage at the port. And that's, I think, a really appropriate example of how the district plan can apply to hazardous substance issues by regulating which activities are occurring near to which other activities. However, a major hazard facility is actually a term of art under the health and safety legislation. And I was concerned that in the Section 42A report, the officer is recommending the conflation of those two terms, which are not the same as each other. And indeed, while the port has been identified as a major hazard facility, the activities that are in the significant hazard facilities list are not all major hazard facilities. And none of them they don't have any overlay that applies to them. And all of that just goes to highlight the need to keep those two concepts separate from each other in my submission. The company's made a further submission in support of Ravensdown's submission seeking deletion of Hazardous Substance Rule 3, which would make any significant hazard facility a discretionary activity. And the Section 42A officer has recommended that that be amended so it only applies to new significant hazard facilities. And I do want to emphasise that that is an acceptable outcome for Hawke's Bay Proteins purposes, as it's an established facility. However, not entirely clear how that rule might apply to expansion by an established facility such as Hawke's Bay Protein. Were they to add an extra production line onto their plant or acquire some adjacent land to put in additional ponds or biofilters or whatever it may be, it's not entirely clear to me whether that would be an existing activity or a new activity. So if that could be clarified to provide for the expansion of existing activities, that would be preferable. Alternatively, my submission is that it would be better for significant hazard facilities to be permitted in the industrial zone. Perhaps there could be controls on significant hazard facilities where they are adjacent to more sensitive zones. But in my submission, that's that sort of rule where hazardous substances are regulated by where they are in relation to other activities is really the appropriate place for the district plan to operate, and that's the type of rule that I think is appropriate if any rule is going to be included in the plan at all. So that would bring me to the conclusion of the company's submissions on hazardous substances, and happy to answer any questions if I can.
Thank you, Mr. Watts. I'll just see if we have questions for you. Any questions?
Yeah, got a couple.
Yep.
Kia ora. Thank you for your submission, Mr. Watts. You mentioned that you found the definition of significant hazard facilities to not be broad enough, essentially. Have you seen a better definition in another plan?
No, I would agree. That definition seems to be, it or something very like it seems to be used in most district plans that include rules about significant hazard facilities. I guess my comment was really directed at its usefulness, given that it doesn't capture many activities that would also store, transport, handle large quantities of hazardous substances. And if you broadened the definition out to include all of those just on the basis that they were storing or handling hazardous substances, then you, in my submission, just really clearly crossing over into the job of HESNO and health and safety legislation to regulate those activities.
Thank you. Perfect segue into my next question. I'm really interested in this this crossover between the different parts of legislation. I know in your submission you've mentioned where you think the two areas are, but what's your understanding of who manages the cumulative effects of HESNO facilities or hazardous facilities adjacent to one another? So under the HESNO or the district plan?
Well, those HESNO regulations do include a lot of, they include concerns about which substances are stored adjacent to in proximity to other substances. So if that's the concern about cumulative activities, I'd say that the HESNO regulations actually cover that off. They're quite specific about what can be stored where in relation to other types of substances. I'm not sure what the cumulative effect is that we're concerned about, to be honest.
Okay, and then I suppose further to that, through your submission, I got the impression that HESNO covers off a lot of the discharge or unexpected discharge of hazardous substances. How much of it is covering off the sort of emergency, like in the emergency and explosion type things? Is that all covered in HESNO as well? Okay.
In terms of how that should be responded to?
Yeah, and I suppose that's where I thought maybe there might be
of the health and safety and work regulation.
Yeah. And does that then cover off the cumulative effects of the side-by-side? Maybe.
Well, I mean, under the health and safety and work legislation, they'll all be required to have extensive plans that respond to the particular risks of that exist on that site and how they'll respond to any emergencies, etc.
Thank you. So the gaps that you see are around sort of reverse sensitivities and any areas of natural significance are the key bits that you think this district plan should be concerned about planning?
Yes, I think those are, my submission is that those are really the proper areas for the district plan to focus on.
Brilliant, thank you.
And Mr. Watts, just two issues from me. The first one's really just a matter of interest at your paragraph 10. I think that was a Judge Kirkpatrick decision. Was that right? Or am I thinking of a different one? The Whakatane decision, was that the Judge Kirkpatrick decision?
I couldn't actually tell you off the top of my head, sorry.
Yeah, was that decision appealed?
If it was, it wasn't on that point.
Right.
I can't tell you now off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to respond to that with a note to the.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that because I've had
hearings panel, if you like.
I mean, the paragraph that you've highlighted, I've had referred to me in other procedures, and I just can't recall if that was the Judge Kirkpatrick decision, the Whakatane one, and if it was appealed, and if that particular part of the decision was addressed in any appeal. So if it doesn't take you long to have a quick look at that, I'll be quite interested.
It won't. I'm sure I can respond quickly after the close of the hearing, or as soon as I'm off camera.
Yeah, great. And now just turning to your conclusion at your paragraph 43, has R3, as you've noted, Hawke's Bay Proteins is a further submitter on the Ravensdown submission. The planning evidence of Carmen Taylor for Ravensdown at her paragraph 414, they now accept the officer's recommended amendment to that rule to have it apply to new facilities.
Yes.
But what Ms Taylor has also, in her planning evidence, and we've yet to give this our full consideration, but she's identified a gap as she sees it in the provisions as notified in relation to the issue that you raised, which is additions or alterations to existing significant hazardous facilities within the general industrial zone. And she's, in her evidence, suggested a permitted activity rule. I queried her about that and invited her to give that some further consideration and to see if there's any appropriate conditions that should apply to that permitted activity rule, just so we can have those kind of options before us. So if you're happy to, I'd invite you to get in touch with Ravensdown planner, Ms Carmen Taylor. She works for Plans Consultants. I'm not sure where she's based. I know they have a big office in Christchurch. And it may be beneficial for you two to put your heads together since you've both identified a similar issue. And if you can assist her in her work, we'd appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. And we've asked her to respond within a 5 working day time frame. So if that fits in with your schedule, then that would be excellent.
Yeah,
and if you're
no
happy to do that, we'd appreciate that and look forward to your further assistance. But other than that, I don't have any further questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks very much. So for anyone watching, we'll now adjourn until we hear from our last submitter for the day, which is the fuel companies.
Are they here? Oh, they are here.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Both representatives from the fuel companies are here, if you can hear us.
Yes, we can. Excellent. So let's proceed. Great. We just can't see you at the moment. Now we can see one of you.
Great.
All right. Good morning and welcome. Thanks for coming in online. And not sure if you were online earlier in the week, but just to let you know, thank you very much for your submissions and your pre-circulated evidence, which you've read, so you don't need to read any of that out to us. But you're very welcome to speak to that, address any key points you'd wish to make, and then we'll see if we have questions for you.
Okay, thank you. I have listened into some of the proceedings earlier this morning, so I've heard from both the council officer and the submitters at the property adjoining the BP bulk fuel storage terminal. And I'll just introduce myself, Georgina McPherson, a planner from SLR Consulting, and joining me today is Jenny Polich from Sherpa Consulting, who has been heavily involved in quantitative risk assessment work for both these terminals and other major hazard facilities around the country, and she can tell you a little bit more about that as well. I'd just like to run you very briefly through some of the key points in my evidence, which are that I am in general support of the officer's recommendations of the set of hazardous substances provisions. The primary intent of myself and Jenny being available today is to provide some additional context and rationale to the risk management overlay provisions, particularly given the finely balanced nature of the risk in this particular location. And in this regard, I'd note that this is the only situation in the country where there's a bulk fuel storage terminal with immediate residential neighbours. Overall, the intent of the risk management provisions is to create greater awareness of the risk that's posed by these terminals, given their classification as major hazard facilities and the nature of the activities undertaken there, and also to ensure that surrounding land use remains compatible with the terminal activities and will not lead to constraints on the ongoing operation of the terminals. And in that regard, I note that the terminals are a critical element of the fuel supply chain for the region, and are recognised as regionally significant infrastructure. So as has been touched on earlier in the day, the risk management approach for these sites has been developed on the basis of the quantitative risk assessment work. And I'll ask Jenny shortly just to run through a couple of the key points on that, and she'll be able to respond to any questions as well. The terminals are managed in accordance with best practice. However, given the nature of substances and the volumes at those sites, there is inherent risk in the nature of activities. The QRA modelling that has been undertaken demonstrates that risk to existing residential properties is currently managed to acceptable levels, but that the introduction of further risk-sensitive activities in close proximity to the terminals may reduce the tolerability of that risk. So one of the questions that was raised by Ms. Gillespie earlier in her presentation was around why there is a need to introduce risk management provisions now, particularly when there's been no change in the risk in a physical sense, practical sense. I do address a number of those reasons in my evidence from para 5.16, and that includes that there is a response to the changing understanding of risk modelling, particularly the Buncefield incident, and the implications that that has had for the management of some other terminals around the country, in particular the Wiri Oil Terminal in Auckland. Introduction of the major hazard facility regulations under the new legislation and the WorkSafe regulations have introduced specific obligations onto major hazard facility operators in terms of their understanding and management and communication of risk issues. The conclusions of the QRA modelling that has been undertaken and the changes that have already been made to the terminal have been needed to ensure that risk does remain at acceptable levels and highlight that this is a relatively finely balanced situation. There's also been experience with development pressure in the area around the terminal sites. Under the current plan provisions, there's a mixed use zoning around the terminals, which permits both industrial and residential activities. Specific development proposals include intensive residential at the Ahuriri Bowling Club opposite the Z Terminal site, and another site at number 25 Coronation Street, which sits just outside the contours but is also very close to the Z Terminal. Council planners have also confirmed that the Ahuriri area does remain a very popular area, and that some of the changes coming through in the proposed district plan, and specifically the uplift of the Battery Road character overlay from the residential properties on Battery Road, may have the effect of enabling further intensification of residential development in very close proximity to the terminal. Some of the other discussion this morning I've noted has been around the rationale for the specific risk management provisions and the way they've been developed from the basis of the QRA modelling and the contour, and the distinction between the sensitive activity contour and the residential activity contour. It's something that Jenny's addressed in her evidence, and I have as well, from Paris 6.13, in which I reached the conclusion that the risk management provisions are set at an appropriate and precautionary level. And it includes, because risk is not solely defined by the line on the plan, there are much broader risk management principles at play. That includes avoiding all avoidable risk, which would likely include intensification of residential or sensitive activities in such close proximity to a major hazard facility. there are other considerations that sit under the quantitative risk assessment framework, and particularly the HIPAP guidance, hazardous industry paper from New South Wales, which emphasise that there is a need for a broader approach in a qualitative sense, as well as a purely quantitative assessment. In this case, the contours are still very close to the terminals. Modelling assumptions around risk can change, which could potentially result in changes to the acceptability of risk, notwithstanding that there may in fact be no physical changes either from the source of the risk or the receiving environment. In a practical sense, the risk of fatality or an effect from a significant incident at the terminal doesn't start and stop on one side of the line as opposed to the other. There would still be effects beyond that, and particularly noting that most of those residential properties in particular are quite small in scale, adjoining a significant facility. And again, the broader concept of avoiding all avoidable risk, and that the District Council does have a role to play in that in terms of their obligations under MHF and their role as a PCBU under the WorkSafe legislation. Those are the key points that I wanted to highlight and draw to your attention. Be happy to respond to questions, but you may prefer first to hear from Jenny on some of the more technical elements of the quantitative risk assessment process.
Yeah, let's hear from Ms. Polish next, and then we'll see if you have any questions. Just in terms of Ms. Polish, your evidence, I found it very comprehensive and clear, and I certainly don't have any questions about the technical basis for the overlay that's been established, but my fellow colleague may have some, but you're very welcome to highlight any key points that you'd wish to make to us at this stage.
Sure, thank you. I think Georgina probably just made quite a lot of the points I was going to make, but look, I'll just give you some background to myself and my involvement in this kind of process, and then maybe reiterate some of the things Georgina said. So yeah, Jenny Pollock I work in a company called Sherpa Consulting, which basically provides process safety and risk management advice, mostly to high hazard industries, not just fuel terminals, all sorts of industries. We also work for regulators and in some cases, some environmental and not-for-profit sort of groups. So my background is chemical engineering originally. I've been working in process safety for probably about 20 years. And quite a lot of that has involved doing quantitative risk assessments or QRAs and, providing advice to both operators and regulators around how to manage potential conflicts, I suppose, between potentially hazardous industries and surrounding land uses. And yeah, in New Zealand, that's probably I've done quite a lot of work in New Zealand in various areas, including the Sea and City area in Auckland when that was being converted from tank farms to basically recreational and mixed use, what it is now, the Wazzle Terminal, which is the main fuel terminal in Auckland, and quite a lot of other fuel terminals and other industries in New Zealand. And I also work in major hazard facility safety case advice and support for major hazard facilities in Australia and New Zealand and various other countries. So that's my background. In this particular context, I was involved in doing the QRA for the Z and the BP sites, nozzle, maybe it was at the time, can't remember, the sites in Napier. So that was my original involvement in this area. So yeah, so I've been just asked to provide some, I guess, background evidence, providing, I suppose, the basis for using risk management overlays, maybe some of their limitations. So I'll just, again, reiterate a few key points. I suppose some things to emphasise. The point of providing any kind of overlay is not just risk management overlays, is to provide some kind of transparent indicator of issues that may surround a source of risk, or amenity issues in some cases like noise and air quality. But in this particular case, a risk overlay is really to try and do two things. I mean, one is to ensure adequate separation distances between hazardous facilities and activities that are potentially sensitive to abnormal incidents that might occur in hazardous facilities. And then the other angle is to avoid encroachment or reverse sensitivity effects on the source of risk, in this case, the hazardous facility, that may constrain either their existing operations or future operations that, you know, might be allowable under their planning things, but may still have an impact on people around them. So they're the two sort of main purposes of having an overlay or a buffer zone or something of that nature around a hazardous facility. Probably could just say there's two potential ways of doing this. I haven't probably addressed this in my evidence, but risk is a function of consequence, which is just an effect or impact, but doesn't account for frequency, and also of frequency. So you could develop an overlay using consequence, and that basically is a bit more absolute in the sense that outside that area there is no consequence of the nature that you're talking about. So if you're talking about distance to fatality, if you use that consequence, there is effectively no risk outside that area of a fatality, so the effect is zero. Or you can use risk, which also accounts for the likelihood of the types of events that could occur. Now, typically touching on something that Georgina raised, for hazardous facilities, usually they have such large quantities of a flammable or toxic material that if there is an abnormal incident involving those, it's quite difficult to contain the effects within the site boundary, regardless of, you know, all the engineering controls or safeguards that you might implement. Just the function of a large inventory being there usually means that you can't contain or fully contain the effects of all incidents within the boundary. So hence you tend to use risk as a more practical means of developing some kind of area of potential effect and judging how significant that is. So typically risk is used as the measure for setting an overlay or buffer around a site. So that just leads me into, I mean, a quantitative risk assessment. Yeah, it's a technical study where it's a model basically. So you set up some consequence models which allow you to predict distances to particular outcomes, and also you assign some frequencies to those particular outcomes, which are either based on statistics or they're based on developing a frequency model for a particular operation. So all of those things can change over time. They can change by advances in modelling. They can change by knowledge of incidents. They can, and that doesn't mean they increase. They could decrease. You could implement more safeguards, in which case the likelihood of some of those incidents would reduce. So, I mean, the point being that, you know, they're developed based on a model, and it's not a, you know, hard line in the sand. I mean, it's, you know, it's just a practical way of saying this area, there are some things that need to be considered. And a buffer provides, or an overlay provides, a transparent way of doing that in a planning system. So at least everyone's fully aware of the potential issues before they embark on a, you know, development application, or before a source of risk embarks on an expansion project or something like that. There's at least some kind of transparent guidance as to, suppose, as to where an issue may occur, or that you don't want to make it worse. So I guess if you're going to use risk, you also need some criteria around what's acceptable and what's intolerable. So again, there are no specific criteria in New Zealand, and what has happened in New Zealand is the criteria from New South Wales and Australia have generally been adopted. They're fairly comprehensive land use risk planning criteria compared to other jurisdictions. They haven't changed in many years, like they've been pretty much the same since the early 1990s. So they're, just to explain about what criteria are. So for a quantitative risk assessment, you have quantitative risk criteria, and they're pitched in two ways. One is individual fatality risk criteria, and that should just be basically viewed as risk at a location. Doesn't account for anyone actually being present, not present. It's just basically the risk at a location. So it's solely a function of the source of risk. And then those criteria are set. Basically, it's a de facto way. So there's different criteria for different sensitivities of land uses. So industrial risk criteria are a higher value than a sensitive land use like a childcare centre or an aged care facility. And the reason for that, it's a de facto way of taking into account both probability of presence and difficulties with evacuation or managing populations if an emergency occurred. So obviously it's far easier to manage a industrial population that's there during the day and are generally able-bodied people and can have some information provided around what to do in an emergency compared to a childcare centre or a hospital, which obviously is a bit more challenging to manage in that kind of situation. So that's the main reason.
Sorry to interrupt, I'm getting on in years. Can you just speak a little bit louder and a little bit slower, please?
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, I think I'm losing my voice a little bit today, so I'll try and up the volume. Is that a bit better?
Yeah, that's better. And then just slow it down a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So individual fatality risk, risk at location, and a function of the source of risk, and different criteria for different land use sensitivities. And then we have societal risk, which is a way of accounting for risks to actual population. That really doesn't account for sensitivity. It's simply numbers of people or population densities within an area that may be affected by the scenarios in the risk model. Then there are qualitative criteria, and they're sort of, I guess, policies or philosophies to follow when managing risk. And as Georgina already mentioned, they're along the lines of things like avoiding avoidable risk, which is pretty much, that's quite open to interpretation. It could mean doing nothing, or it could mean taking a sort of pragmatic approach to what is avoidable risk. There's also some guidance around reducing risk where it's possible to do so, even if the quantitative criteria are met. And then ideally, if the risk is already high, don't intensify that risk or increase the risk. Right, so that's the background to quantitative risk. So, I mean, risk models are fairly complicated, difficult to understand if you don't have a background in some kind of probably engineering or science, not really a suitable tool for managing risk in the public sense. So often the outputs from the risk model can be simplified into an overlay. And in this case, typically what is used is the individual fatality risk contour. And that provides both a means of, typically they're used to avoid the encroachment of populations that are more sensitive than the source of risks. And typically that would be residential or sensitive type land uses. And then the other thing that it tries to achieve is it's a de facto way of at least identifying where there's a significant increase in population for any land use really, and trying to trigger some kind of assessment of whether that's appropriate from a societal risk point of view. So the overlay tries to achieve those two things. I mean, you could also provide restrictions around population densities, but that's quite difficult to do in a planning sense, and it's also quite difficult to monitor in any meaningful way. So that's not a very common approach in planning. Right, so yeah, so that's the background to QRA. I've already mentioned that risk contours are developed from a model and hence may change based on changes in model, changes in operating practices at the source of risk itself, or if additional control measures or safeguards are implemented, that would obviously reduce the risk. But it's quite difficult for these kind of facilities to fully eliminate the risk. So bringing that all back to, I guess, the Napier situation. So as has been mentioned, I mean, Napier is a fairly unusual example where there's an existing hazardous facility with very close proximity to residential type land uses. And there has been, I suppose, intensification in terms of population around that terminal. The terminals have implemented pretty much all the reasonably practicable engineering type risk reduction measures that can be implemented at these fuel terminals at this point in time. So the risk is probably not going to get lower than it is, short of removing particularly the gasoline inventories or significantly reducing throughputs or something of that nature. That like there would need to be some significant operational changes at the terminals to substantially reduce the risk any further. So the overlay, in my view, is a sort of pragmatic way of just triggering a transparent consideration of any further introduction of more sensitive land uses around the terminals, and also providing a way of assessing any significant increases in population that might occur around that terminal. So to my mind, this kind of approach is like a pragmatic link between risk and planning. So that's probably my main points, but I think Georgina had already covered most of them, but I'm happy to take any questions or expand on anything if you have any questions.
All right, thank you very much for that. I'll just see if we have questions. So Haley, just any questions for either Ms McPherson or Ms Pollock?
Sure. I'll start with you. Thank you, Jenny. Fellow chemical and process engineer, so I followed along pretty well there.
Great.
Just interested in your commentary around the selection of the sensitive contour as opposed to residential in this example.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this particular example, as I mentioned, I mean, individual fatality risk criteria are they have different values as a kind of de facto way of accounting for probability of presence and difficulty in emergency planning. In this particular case, because there is already quite a bit of residential development around the terminals, and also the use of this in trying to manage populations as well, I think it's probably better to use the lowest contour that's there. So that's, you know, my view on this. I suppose something to point out is, as I mentioned before, the risk's not zero outside those contours that are shown. If you look at the societal risk quantitative criteria, the frequencies go down to 1 × 10⁻⁹. So that's quite a few factors of 10 lower than the individual fatality risk criteria. So in my view here, given just the existing land uses and populations that are in proximity to the terminal, it's more appropriate to use the sensitive land use contour.
Okay, thank you. And just sort of more out of curiosity, have you got a contour that was just purely on the consequence? You talked about that different type of modelling.
Yeah, so there's, well, certainly in the QRA report, there's the information for the distances to the consequence endpoint is in the report. I don't recall if there was an actual overlay, but I can tell you, look, to give you some background about the events at fuel terminals that cause the largest consequences. The worst case event usually that can occur at these normal fuel terminals that handle just standard hydrocarbons like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. Gasoline is the highest hazard product because it is the most flammable and it can form the most amounts of flammable vapor. The worst thing that can happen in a terminal from a off-site event point of view would be an extended overfill of a gasoline storage tank. So that's basically the Bumsfield scenario that Georgina referred to. For terminals that import by ship, which this terminal does, a pretty typical effect distance for that kind of scenario is 350 to 500 metres. Okay, so it depends on the type of tank, the rate you're importing, but typically the worst case consequence to a fatality endpoint for that kind of scenario would be 350 to 400 metres. And that the exact, you know, the modelled number for these terminals is in the report. But if you looked at a consequence overlay it would be of the order of 350, 400 metres, as opposed to these risk overlays, which are obviously much smaller because they account for the very low frequency of that type of event and include the effect of the control measures that are in place. So they're things like level instrumentation, high level shutdowns if you get through the trip, gas detection in bunds, that sort of thing. They account for those sort of things working and preventing that scale of event occurring.
Thank you. And potentially one for Georgina. Under Hazard Policy 2, talks about ensuring significant hazardous facilities are appropriately located and managed in order to reduce risks to the environmental and community to acceptable levels. I was wondering if you could provide commentary around what acceptable levels would mean, like how would that be defined for you?
Sure. Well, I think in the context of these types of facilities, the bulk fuel storage facilities, you would certainly be looking to the QRA and the land use management guidance that's set through the HIPAP guidance, and that's the conclusion for these QRAs is set out in that framework in terms of the acceptability of risk, in terms of where it sits in the contours for these sites. That's translated into the mapped overlay in the plan. I am aware of some plans around the country where they have looked to define or include a definition for a term acceptable risk or acceptable levels of risk. And I think it starts to draw in some of the concerns that some of the earlier submitters have raised around the scope of the definition of significant hazardous facility and what's captured by that. There are quite a few facilities in that list that you wouldn't typically look at locational elements based on an individual fatality risk. Something like a wastewater treatment plant, there'll be a range of reasons you may choose to locate that in one location as opposed to another, but individual fatality risk is not typically the driver for that. So a definition of acceptable levels of risk that is tied to something like the individual fatality risk contour, and which is where I've seen some of the other plans going, to my mind is quite problematic.
Okay.
When you've got in the context of a policy that applies to generally, and I think that to generally all significant hazardous facilities in the wording of that policy. So I think that, that potentially there'd be scope to develop something bespoke for these specific facilities where risk is quantified and measured in terms of an individual fatality contour. But on the flip side, because of the presence of the overlays, which provide very clear guidance on that, together with the rule, the new rule reference RX, which talks about additions and alterations to those mapped facilities in terms of whether or not it exceeds the existing modelled contour. I don't think there's a need to go down that track.
Okay.
I think it just then starts to introduce those difficulties around applying that policy to all of the other types of significant hazardous facilities that are included in that definition.
Okay. I think when I read the policy and then I think that rule RX covers off quite a narrow risk and defines like the risk of fatality and what is acceptable there. But the policy also speaks to the environment and more broadly community. And so I suppose just wondering, sort of strikes me that we've defined one area of risk but not, health as opposed to safety, environmental concerns and I suppose amenity to a certain extent. Have you seen rules that would define those acceptable levels anywhere?
Yeah, sure. And I guess in the context of the role, I think it really acts as a trigger for the need for assessment.
Yeah.
And if that was the case, you could take those other types of considerations into account. I think we had a few discussions with council around how to approach this, and the particular concern from the fuel company perspective is that there's really no need to control changes to a facility that don't actually change the level of risk. So that might be your changes to landscaping, your changes to an office building that would otherwise fall under the definition of the facility and then trigger it as discretionary activity consent.
Yeah.
When in fact there may be reasons in other parts of the plan under the industrial zone provisions to manage those other types of activities, but not in terms of the risk. So this is what we settled on because it is a discretionary status. I think you could look at those things more broadly. Yeah, I think again, as some of the earlier submitters commented, there is a bit of a jurisdictional issue around discharges, and that those sit primarily with a regional council level, and so the primary function, I think, of these provisions is to be looking at managing the risk to surrounding populations in terms of a land use compatibility issue.
Okay, and thanks. Just to the staff, could we address that same issue in our reply report, please? Thank you.
Okay. So, Ms. Polish, no questions from me, but thank you very much for your evidence and your verbal expansion on that. It is an interesting area, and I initially trained as an engineer as well, and I've considered these issues not in relation to hazardous substances, but in relation to debris flows impacting on an existing community in the Bay of Plenty. So it's a very interesting area. But Ms. McPherson, just a question for you, two questions. There's only one overlay in the district plan, and it applies to the fuel company's site. There are no other facility risk management overlays in the district plan. Should the terminology therefore be significant hazardous facility risk management overlay or major hazardous facility risk management overlay? We just heard earlier from a solicitor acting for Hawke's Bay Proteins who suggested that it was not appropriate to conflate the two, and that where there is an overlay, the terminology should be major hazardous facility risk management overlay. Do either of you have a view on that?
Sure. Yes, I heard his submissions as well. My understanding of the notified version of this chapter was that there wasn't necessarily a deliberate intent to distinguish between a major hazard facility and a significant hazard facility. If that was to be the case, I think that there would then need to be two distinct definitions and that clear reference back to major hazard facility as it's defined under the major hazard facility regulations.
Right.
And I think that the way it was drafted left a bit of uncertainty around that.
Yep.
Yes, these two facilities are lower tier major hazard facilities, so potentially they could be labelled in that way, but consideration would then need to be given to those flow-on effects in terms of do you then need policies to specifically also reference major hazard facilities as well as significant hazard facilities. So I think it's really a matter of where those thresholds are set and how they're then reflected through the remainder of the provisions in the plan. And also whether the council's intentionally wanting to draw a distinction between something that's defined under the major hazard facility regulations and significant hazard facilities as defined under the plan.
Yep. So I guess where it comes down to then in my mind is because there is only one overlay and it applies to the fuel company's side, is the fuel company's content with it being referred to as a significant hazardous facility risk management overlay? Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, in that context, yes.
All right then, so just my next question relates to your paragraph 7.1.
Yes.
And it's just your recommended amendment to that rule, which I understand is designed to cater for the existing subdivided lot at 2A Bull Street. Are there any other lots within the overlay that would be affected by this provision? Or is it solely designed for that one lot?
It is solely designed for that one lot. It's a situation that's probably not ideal in terms of the timing and the way this has unfolded, and that we had started having these discussions with the council around introduction of risk management overlays and controls on intensification sensitive activities around the terminal with the policy team, and in the meantime a consent application was lodged to subdivide this site, which I believe was probably a controlled activity in terms of the rules in the operative plan, which in a way also highlights the concern from the fuel companies around the permissive nature of the existing provisions in terms of the ability to develop and change land uses and introduce further residential activities. And so, but in recognition of that, and coming back to this distinction in the modelling between the residential contour and the sensitive activity contour, and this is where I think it is a fairly finely balanced situation that we can conclude that risk to a single residential development at that site actually is at acceptable levels in terms of where the modelling sits, but for the broader reasons that both Jenny and I have gone into in a bit more detail, there are broader risk considerations, land use compatibility issues at play that do lead us down the track of saying we don't think that it's appropriate to continue to enable further residential intensification as a permitted or controlled activity without the ability to give consideration to and assess the appropriateness of the risk context, and both the risk to the new activity and any implications in terms of reverse sensitivity or potential constraints on operation of the fuel terminals.
Yeah, that's a very long answer. So, I mean, there's no appetite on behalf of the fuel companies to amend the overlay boundary to cater for this one lot, is that correct?
No, it sits within the model. I think, as Jenny's outlined, there's very limited ability to revisit the modelling to in such a way that the contour would be withdrawn entirely from that site, given it's immediately adjacent to the bund.
Yeah.
That would require quite significant changes to the current operations. Otherwise, it would, I guess, be a decision around how the modelling is translated into the risk management contour. And I think it's hard to justify why a single property, or why that contour wouldn't be applied to a single property as opposed to any others.
Yep.
That also fall within that same contour.
So if the boundary remains the same, then the assessed risk remains the same. So why should we provide an exemption? Why should we agree to the amendment that you're suggesting if the risk remains the same?
Well, the intent is to recognise that risk to a single residential property, a dwelling on that site would be at acceptable levels. It's currently vacant, so that I think there are issues around natural justice if there was to be a restriction placed on being able to develop that site after it's been subdivided with a very clear intent for it to be used for residential.
So if we were to accept this recommendation of the amendment of the rule, what would be the activity status of building a dwelling on that site?
It would fall to whatever the provisions in the underlying plan are. And that would, I assume, and I haven't gone into detail of it, but I would expect that in the general residential zone, it would be a permitted activity, but given the very small size of that site, I would expect that likely be needing some sorts of consents for bulk and location infringements.
Yeah.
I haven't reviewed their specific consent applications. I'm not aware of the specific consent triggers.
Yeah.
For which they needed a resource consent, the one granted in January this year.
Yeah, and I think they have gained consent for their dwelling on that site.
Yeah.
So,
And so the distinction was that when that consent was granted, these provisions had been notified but don't have legal effect because they're part of the proposed plan. But the concern that was raised with me by those submitters was that they may not actually be in a position to give effect to that resource consent within the lapse time frame of 5 years. In which case this would be where this provision would come into play and enable them to proceed with a residential development under the plan provisions, other than with this risk management, with the non-complying activity status applied to a single residential dwelling.
in that case, so there's two options, isn't there? The owners of 2A Bull Street could simply apply for an extension to the lapse date, or they could, if the consent does lapse and then they wish to seek a new consent, I mean, based on what you've just told us, the fuel companies would give written approval because you've said the risk to that new dwelling on that site is acceptable, and so they'd pass through the minor effects gateway under a non-complying activity, wouldn't they?
Well, potentially, yes. Obviously, we'd need to see what the development proposal on the table was, but that undertaking has been given by the terminal operator to not look to frustrate development of a single residential dwelling on that site.
Yeah.
So yes, that certainly is an alternative option.
And was that undertaking from the fuel companies, was that given in writing to the owners of that site?
No, it's proving more verbally. We're in direct discussions with the fuel companies, but it is something that we could firm up if there was a need or a request from the submitter to do that.
Right. Okay. No, I've just been asking you these questions because it's unusual to have a rule in a district plan designed to cater for just one lot that doesn't have general wider application, and so I'm actually quite I guess I'm yet to be persuaded about the merits of that. But we'll hear from the officers in their reply report what their view on that is. But no further questions from me. Any further questions? No. So unless there's anything you want to add by way of conclusion, we don't have any further questions for you.
No, I didn't have anything to add to that. Jenny, did you have any further comments?
No, not at this stage, no.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for coming in this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
And so with that, we're now adjourned for the day, and the next hearing will occur in December on the day starting on the 4th of December for hearing stream number 2. Thank you.